Is that a sign of the times? Is it more indicative of identity or more related to medical issues?
Well, I think it's just really illumination that that the map of who we are is so complicated, and that we think so much about race and ethnicity, but that there's so much more to it. And I mean, if we talked about other markers that could connect the people in this room beyond race and ethnicity, I think we'd find a lot. And sometimes it might be medicine, an ailing parent or a relative who's sick with a certain disease. People can connect across boundaries because of those issues.
I think that's where the science of DNA is really helpful and can potentially be pretty on target in terms of revealing medical issues, preventing certain diseases. I think as far as identity goes, it's much more slippery and so much based on your interpretation of the results. And yeah, so I think that the science of DNA, when it comes to questions of identity, is imprecise and subjective.
So did that affect the inspiration for your plays?
Well, I think there are a fair number of these plays also that are about the issue of nature versus nurture. So questions of identity and of disease both relate to the nature side of it. And then nurture becomes, what do you do with the raw material that you were given when you came into this world? And I think that all of the plays in some sense are about that issue.
I mean, my play arose out of the fact that I was starting an adoption process at about the same time I was offered the commission, and then something that Peter Gray, who's here in the audience, one of our scientists that we met with, said during one of our panels, which is, if I'm paraphrasing now, but DNA can tell you what, your height, your hair color, but nurture tells you who. And so this idea kept resonating with me as I was about to meet my daughter, So that's where my play came out of.
And you have all these ideas of what you think you're going to write about, and then you don't write about that. I had actually planned to do something. I wanted to do actually a 12-minute musical.
That's right.
And write these, and like sort of almost like an operetta, like I'll write all these songs and tie them into, and have a lot of fun, because with 12 minutes, sometimes you're feeling like, well, you have to write something punchy and fast and funny and in music. But then the thing that came out was a much more connected to Valina's piece and having to do with family history of a mental disease or something like, that kind of stuff. And so it surprised me, and of course it also made it a much more difficult thing to write, because it's much more a burn this kind of thing, where you don't put this on stage, burn it, after you've written it. But that's how it. So we surprised us in that way where it went.
Well, I was. This will lead in, I think, to my final playlet, but I was interested in personal mythology, and I have this thing I've done over the years. I've gone by various pseudonyms, and I've taken on these names, and at various times I've been Felix, I've been Joaquin, I've been Pablo, and I've just taken them on and become that person. When I was working at Shakey's Pizza, I was known as Felix, and so for me the idea was, of course, that must mean something, and that in my past life, I, of course, was Portuguese. And so when I was approached for this, when Jamil and Malik approached me, I thought, of course, this is going to explain my personal mythology. And as with everyone else, I was disappointed in that I started out in East Africa, went to Japan, and then it stopped, which is what, of course, I always knew. And so what came from that is that I actually didn't know what to write, and I was waiting to write, and everyone else had written, and so I thought, since I can't write anything, when you see these types of plays done by various playwrights, they usually feel disjointed, and so I thought what I could give Steve and everyone else was interstitial material, stuff that can go between to connect them. And so what I did is I came up with a questionnaire of these variety of questions, some which were offensive, some which were stupid, and some I thought were reasonably germane. And there were questions like, if you had to have a baby with one person in the group, despite the fact your genders, might not work, who would that be? Who would you mate with?
Most of them were David.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. David, everyone wanted to mate with David. But then what happened is that the last time we got together, on the plane flight coming in, a play came to me, and it ended up being about a father a son visiting his dead father's body. And again, you know, as with everyone, you're not quite sure what you're going to write. You absorb all this material, you have a response to it, and then you write what you write. And I wasn't quite sure how it would connect with everything. But we read it, and it seemed to, in some way, you know, because of this chemistry, to sort of insinuate itself in work.
Well,
And,
let's read it.
Okay. I'm going to stand and read this because me standing is about as tall as Jamil sitting.
This is an excerpt from Child is a Father to Man by Philip Kangotanda.
My little niece wakens and says, "A bird. A big, beautiful bird came out of the top of Grandpa's head, flew around the room, and then went out the window." The phone rings. It is the hospital. We gather around the hospital bed, and I look at my father's body. It is 3:45 in the morning. My two brothers and I are exhausted. My mother quiet. My father looks, he's a corpse. Sunken cheeks, drawn, grayish skin. I'm repulsed. Whatever or whoever this is, it is not my father. This is a large, sick animal wandered into this hospital and fallen dead in his room. An ancient trunk of some long-felled, decaying oak. A whale that mysteriously beached itself and chosen death in this very public place of hope and healing. This is a sick joke perpetrated by a cruel, cruel God. This empty container, this discarded packaging of something once so. He heard they needed Japanese doctors on the West Coast. So on a break, he hitched a ride from the University of Arkansas Med School to see for himself. His mother and father were born in Hiroshima, and he on the island of Kauai. He meets the daughter of a well-to-do businessman. They marry. The war breaks out. They are hauled all the way to Rower, Arkansas, and are imprisoned there for 3 years. They return home. They beget 3 sons. One becomes a doctor, one becomes a law professor, one becomes. The father wonders where this son came from. No one in his family, no one in his wife's family, has ever shown this odd affliction. The father lectures the son, grounds him, threatens to cut him off in hopes to reshape this errant internal mapping. The son himself attempts to break this imperative by returning to school and becoming a lawyer. But it will not erase itself. It will not mutate. It continues to inform. The youngest son reverts, and the father disowns him. They struggle. They war to establish contested territory, his and his legacy, to the death of something. It is mythic, biblical, it is stupid, and yet a tale repeated over and over since the beginning.
That's so beautiful.
Steve, will you speak a little about directing an evening of collective plays, putting them together? Is it very different from directing one play by one author?
Yeah, it's a lot more interesting, actually. You know, there's kind of the thought that doing 7 short plays is probably just as easy as doing one long play, and it's really not. I mean, there's 7 very distinctive plays, and my job and the job of the actors and the designers is to bring each of these worlds to life as vibrantly as we can. And therein lies the challenge and also the great joy of it. I mean, as you've heard, you know, you've heard 3 very distinctive pieces already, and the other 4 are just as distinctive and just as idiosyncratic and just as beautiful, and in some cases just as funny and all of that.